What happened that freezing Montana night would either damn them both or save their souls forever. The blizzard howled outside the abandoned mining lodge, its icy breath rattling the wooden shutters like skeletal fingers. Inside the stone fireplace threw dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls, and she knelt before him on the bearskin rug, her obsidian eyes blazing with an intensity that made the winter storm seem tame by comparison. Her raven hair fell wild around her shoulders, adorned with silver ornaments and eagle feathers that caught the firelight. Her buckskin dress, torn from days of running through the frozen wilderness, revealed glimpses of bronzed skin marked with traditional Sioux tattoos. But it was her voice that stopped his heart cold. "If I give you everything tonight," she whispered, her breath warm against the frigid air, "will you promise me forever?" Jacob Morrison, a former cavalry officer turned bounty hunter, felt something crack inside his chest. He tracked desperate men across 3 territories, faced down killers in saloons from Denver to Deadwood, but nothing had prepared him for the raw vulnerability in those words. He'd come to this remote lodge in the Bitterroot Mountains seeking shelter from the 1881 winter storm. Instead, he'd found her hiding in the shadows, a Lakota woman fleeing from something that had left terror etched in every line of her face. But here's what Jacob didn't know yet. Her next words would change everything he believed about redemption. Her people, the Lakota, had been at war with men like him for decades. Blood had flowed like rivers between their worlds. Yet here she was, offering not the cry of vengeance, but a plea wrapped in desperate hope. The storm seemed to press closer around the lodge, timber wolves howling somewhere in the darkness beyond the frosted windows. The scent of pine smoke and leather filled the air as Jacob struggled to find his voice. She reached for his scarred hands, her fingers trembling. Not from cold, but from the courage it took to speak such words to a man who wore the uniform of her people's enemies. He realized she wasn't just offering her body. She was offering her trust, her spirit, her very life in exchange for something he'd never given anyone. A promise of forever. Jacob had never stayed anywhere long enough to call it home. He drifted from town to town like smoke on the wind, leaving behind only whispers of his reputation and the graves of men who'd crossed him. But here was this woman, fierce as a mountain cat, yet fragile as winter ice, daring him to break the pattern that had defined his entire adult life. When his eyes met hers, he saw more than desire burning there. He saw the weight of survival, the desperation of someone caught between 2 worlds that both wanted her dead. And though she spoke her offer like a prayer, he could feel the steel beneath her words. The strength of a woman who understood that forever wasn't a promise made lightly in this unforgiving land. Wait, because what she whispered next would haunt him for the rest of his life. Jacob drew her closer to the fire, its warmth painting their skin in gold and shadow. For the first time since the war ended, he felt the pull of something greater than his thirst for whiskey, stronger than his hunger for the next bounty, more powerful than the demons that rode his back across every trail. It was the pull of belonging, the impossible idea that this woman, this storm, this moment could alter the course of his cursed fate. She pressed her head against his chest, listening to the beat of a heart that had been hardened by battlefield carnage, but somehow softened by her presence. He realized her whisper carried more power than any Colt 45 he'd ever drawn. This wasn't just about one night of passion. This was about eternity carved into 2 souls who should never have met but somehow found each other in this frozen sanctuary. Jacob thought of all those empty nights he'd spent alone on the trail, with only his horse and the ghosts of dead men for company. The loneliness had been like a physical wound, never quite healing. But now, with her warmth pressed against him, that emptiness felt like something from another man's life. She whispered again, softer this time, her lips brushing his ear, and he felt the raw honesty in her words. She wasn't bargaining for affection. She was surrendering her heart to a future that terrified and thrilled her equally. Jacob lifted her chin gently, forcing her to meet his gaze, and what he saw there made his breath catch in his throat. The courage of a warrior burned alongside the vulnerability of a woman who dared to love across impossible battle lines. The flames lit her skin like burnished copper, highlighting every curve, every scar that spoke of her fight to survive in a world that wanted her people erased from existence. He knew with crystal clarity that if he walked away from this lodge, he'd be abandoning the one thing he'd never truly possessed, a reason to stop running. The mountain silence wrapped around them, broken only by the crack of burning wood and the distant cry of a hunting owl. Finally, Jacob found the strength to speak. His voice emerged rough as gravel, barely above a whisper, but weighted with something he'd buried since the war. If you give me your heart tonight, I swear I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to give you forever. But you haven't heard the most shocking part yet. She looked up at him, her lips curving in a smile that was both tender and dangerous. Dangerous because it meant she'd claimed a piece of his soul that no bullet, no badge, no wandering trail could ever reclaim. As the fire burned lower and the storm raged harder outside, the promise of forever hung between them like a sacred vow carved into the wild heart of the Montana wilderness. Dawn came quietly to the Bitterroot Mountains, stretching pale fingers of light across the snow-covered peaks and casting long shadows against the lodge where they'd shared a night that neither would ever forget. Though the fire had died to glowing embers, the heat of her whispered promise still burned in Jacob's chest like a brand he could never erase. He woke to find her standing at the frost-covered window, her silhouette outlined against the morning light. Her hair spilled like dark water down her back, her body still wrapped in the buckskin dress adorned with silver and feathers. But her gaze was fixed on the endless expanse of mountains and valleys beyond, and Jacob realized that forever wasn't just a word they'd spoken in passion. It was a question this harsh land demanded they answer with their very lives. She turned when she heard him rise, her eyes sharp as a hawk's, but soft with the memory of his touch. In that look, he felt both the weight of centuries of conflict between their peoples and the fragile hope that somehow, against impossible odds, they could carve out a place for themselves. Jacob knew men like him weren't built for forever. His kind drifted like tumbleweeds across the prairie, chased by old enemies, haunted by the blood on their hands, always one step ahead of their past. Yet something in the way she reached for his hand as the mountain wind whispered through the pines made him believe that maybe, just maybe, he could stand his ground long enough to keep his promise. Here's where their story takes a turn you won't see coming. She spoke quietly, her words carrying both fierce pride and honest fear. She told him of the dangers that lay ahead, how her surviving people would never accept a white man, especially a former soldier. How his own kind would brand her a savage and him a traitor. The world would try to tear them apart with everything it had. But she also told him that her heart had already chosen its path, that she would follow him into whatever battles awaited, as long as he didn't abandon her to the silence of a broken promise. Jacob listened, his weathered hands cradling hers, feeling the contrast between his gun-calloused palms and her smooth skin. He thought of all the things he'd spent his life running from: military tribunals, vengeful families of dead outlaws, the crushing weight of his war crimes. For the first time in 15 years, he wondered what it might feel like to stop running and start fighting for something, instead of just against it. The mountains stretched endlessly before them, beautiful and merciless, a place where forever could mean tomorrow or a lifetime, depending on how hard they were willing to fight for it. Though he had no guarantees, Jacob found himself daring to imagine a future where her whispered promise would echo not just in stolen moments, but in every sunrise that followed. He pulled her close, breathing in the scent of pine smoke and wildness that clung to her hair, and told her with a roughness that betrayed the emotion threatening to break him that he would try. Though he couldn't promise eternity, he would give her every breath he had left to draw. In that moment, she smiled as though he'd handed her the mountains themselves. Together they walked back to the dying fire, the old lodge seeming to creak its approval of a vow that defied every law of the frontier. Though danger stalked them from all directions, though bullets and betrayal were never far away, they carried the fragile strength of a promise whispered in firelight. Jacob's mind wandered to impossible possibilities. Rebuilding this lodge, maybe running cattle in the high meadows, perhaps even watching children play in the same snow where their love had been born. The thought terrified him, but it also filled him with something he thought the war had killed: hope. She leaned into his warmth, her fingers intertwined with his, and together they faced the sun rising over the wild Montana peaks. They knew each day would demand sacrifice, that survival would require them to be stronger together than they'd ever been apart. The world might not grant them forever, but in that moment, with the horizon stretching endlessly before them, and their promise burning bright as the morning star, they both believed they'd found something more precious than survival. They'd found meaning, purpose, a love no outlaw gang, no cavalry unit, no tribal council could ever destroy. As the golden light spread across the mountain wilderness, it seemed as though the land itself had accepted their sacred vow, binding them to each other in a story that would echo through the frontier long after the fire and whispers were nothing but memory. If this mountain love story has captured your heart, if you felt the bite of that Montana winter and the power of a promise that defied every rule of the Wild West, then stay with us. Their greatest trials are still ahead, and you won't believe the price they'll have to pay for forever. Subscribe and journey with us deeper into the untamed heart of the frontier.